We're diving into the hard discussions after an Ohio State blowout for the Gophers football team. We got to dive into the hard questions I am getting from you, the fans, the listeners, ready to talk about what needs to happen next today at Locked On Golden Gophers.
Hey, you are Locked On Golden Gophers.
No matter what we're going to do here, we're just going to keep rowing.
Your daily podcast on the Minnesota Golden Gophers.
However it turns out, we're just going to keep rowing.
Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
We're just going to keep rowing, and keep rowing.
You're listening to Locked On Golden Gophers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Kane Rob, host of the podcast, former collegiate football video coordinator and recruiting assistant, here to talk Golden Gophers with you each and every day of the week, Monday through Friday. And today we've got a lot to talk about, a lot of Gophers football, but we also need to talk about the women's basketball team that took on UConn, number 8 ranked team in the country, at the barn, a packed barn. We're going to talk about what we learned from that game, but we have to talk about Gophers football against Ohio State this week because it was a disappointing effort. Not even the result, but the effort that the Gophers put on was absolutely disappointing. And then I'm going to answer your hard questions because I've been getting them week after week after week, and I'm finally going to dive in. We're going to talk about the coaching. We're going to talk about the quarterback. We're going to talk about where do we go from here. You're definitely going to want to tap in. Be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any of the daily Gophers content coming out each and every day for you, because I am sure we're going to have to dive into those hard questions all off season long. So be sure to follow wherever you get the podcast at Locked On Golden Gophers. Now let's talk about this Ohio State loss because it was uninspired play from the Gophers versus Ohio State in a 37-3 loss. Now we had a big anticipation that we were going to lose. There was a lot of, can we keep it competitive? Not even can we win the game from the fan base. But when we watched that game on Saturday, it looked like the Gophers football team itself, the coaches, the players, what have you, all looked like they knew they were going to lose, and they played to try and lose by less. That's what that outing looked like. It didn't look like we thought we could go and try to pull an upset. It didn't look like we believed in ourselves whatsoever. It looked like, let's try to go home with the lowest score possible that we can put up against Ohio State. Meaning, can Ohio State score as few points as possible and we just get back home? That's what it felt like. We gave up 292 yards in the first half. Not terrible, not great. But what was more impressive from the defense is they only gave up 13 points in that first half, having had Ohio State nearing the red zone on every offensive drive that they were going on, basically, except for the very last drive before the half where the Gophers pinned them in their own territory and were pretty aggressive on that front. But the defense held them to 2 field goals, only 1 offensive score, and that first offensive score was the first drive of the game for Ohio State, a drive in which it looked like it was going to be Purdue all over again. But then the defense found a way to stand strong, stand tall, hold them to field goals on 2 other drives, and then keep them out of any late last second scoring in that first half. The Gophers don't call any timeouts at the end of the first half, don't really try to get into it, maybe have a chance at scoring again. Again, it was lackluster. It looked like we just were trying to get the game over with as soon as possible. But what we've seen from this defense, especially in the last 2 weeks, is that if this defense can't force sacks and it can't create turnovers, then they're usually getting gashed and picked apart. So the Gophers have had issues. Now, yes, injuries come into play there, but it's not just injuries. Injuries reared their head again in this one. Darius Green was lost in this game. Zach Evans on the offensive side of the ball was lost in this game. But it doesn't look the same. The fire from the defense, the fire we've seen for the past 3 years, even 3 years ago when Joe Rossi was in his first year or interim with the Gophers, it looked more fired up from the defensive side of the ball. And I have mentioned this again over the course of the season, but it just looks like there isn't that passion, that energy, that firing up of the defense as a unit. And it stems from a handful of players usually that helps fire up the entire unit, but it just doesn't look like we have that this season. It doesn't look like we have that I don't know, that swagger about us when it comes to defensive energy. Last year, you saw it a ton from Mariano Sori-Marin, from Thomas Rush. We've seen it from Jack Givens in the past. Like, there are multiple times where we've seen players fired up and it fires up the whole team around them. And we saw it in limited spurts this year with Cody Lindenberg, but Cody Lindenberg only played 2 games in the season. And when he's not on the field, it feels like no one else brings that swagger, brings that energy, brings that fire to fire up the whole unit. Now, Tyler Nubin does bring it on occasion, but it's usually after he makes a big play, an interception, a game-changing play, a big hit. That's when he gets fired up, and then some folks tend to fire up around him. But if those plays aren't coming, and if Cody Lindenberg isn't on the field, this Gophers defense doesn't have that oomph, that macho, that machismo, that swagger, whatever you want to call it. This Gophers defense has lacked it, and I think that reflects on how they have played and how they have been gashed and how they've been picked apart. It starts to show more and more because it feels like that believe that, hey, we are a top defense. Hey, we can do this. Hey, it just doesn't feel like it's there. Now, is that stemming from injuries? Probably a little bit. Like I said, when Cody Lindenberg's in there, it is definitely more present, but that it can't just be one player, because if it's one player, when you're missing that player, everything falls apart. So they have to find a way to solve that issue into the next season, hopefully in this Wisconsin game, hopefully in a bowl game if they can beat Wisconsin. But that is definitely something that we are unused to seeing with this Gophers defense. Now you flip to the offensive side of ball in this Ohio State game, and I just had so many questions. Why does this coaching staff refuse to be aggressive on offense? This game was a game that nobody had expectations for. Nobody was like, this Gophers team has any chance of beating Ohio State. Nobody. Not one person out there. Actually, I lied. Tristyn Spann-Ford was all in. He was a believer, and he can talk himself into anything. And you know this, I know this, and that's why we love him. But on top of that, outside of him, I don't know one player, one analyst, anybody that was like, hey, I think Minnesota is going to go in there and upset Ohio State. Nobody did. You have no expectations. So why not go for it? Why not go all out? Why not do the unexpected? Why not be aggressive? Go for it on third. Go for it on fourth. And even those people who are like, why would we go for it on fourth? I think Coach Fleck was asked in the presser on the road, like, why he didn't go for it on 4th and 5 and whatnot. I'm not even stressed about the 4th down attempts. I'm stressed about the attempts prior to the 4th down. The 3rd and 7, but we run an outside zone and then punt. The 3rd and 5, and we run and punt. And those were in Ohio State's territory. There were other 3rd downs where we just decided to run. Why? Why not be aggressive? Why not scheme something open? It looked like after that first drive, Athan missed Elijah Spencer on a very open pass on that first drive from the get-go. I think it was 1st down, maybe it was 2nd down, but regardless, it was right there. And then all of a sudden the coaches were like, we're not going to pass game for like the next 2 drives. You have to get aggressive. You have to, give a second chance in there and not play to lose by the fewest amount of points. That's just what it looked like, what it felt like, and what we continue to see from this Gophers team. Now, how do you fix that in the offseason? That's the question, the $1 million question, and I don't know if there's a winning answer for it right now. But conservative play might have worked when we had Mo Ibrahim, because Mo Ibrahim could bail you out. Heck, it maybe even worked when Darius Taylor was the running back, because again, he could bail you out. But your strength on offense, once he went down, Darius Taylor, and that's not to say anything bad about the other running backs, because they have showed that they can step up and answer the call from time to time. Zach Evans, Jordan Nubin, they can get it done. And they did have some big outputs. But your strength on this offense, as soon as Darius Taylor went down for injury for multiple games, is Daniel Jackson and Brevin Spann-Ford when you get him going early. But we turned into a more conservative approach still, keeping the ball on the ground, trying to do as little as possible, holding on to 3-point leads instead of putting on the points. And in the Illinois game, it burned you and you lost. In the Northwestern game, it burned you and you lost. We played for the scoreboard to look okay versus Ohio State and a Michigan, and yet it still looked ugly. We still lost bad, 52-10 and 37-3. Those are not good-looking scores. You played for it not to look bad, and it still looked bad. Meanwhile, Coach Locksley over at Maryland plays aggressive. His quarterback throws 3 interceptions and has a safety, and he still goes back to him, has the belief, has the confidence, and keeps being aggressive and finishes in a 1-score game with Michigan down to the wire. And even though they lost, they were competitive. They got respect from other teams, and they were in that thing. Most points that's put up on Michigan. Michigan's ranking and their overall credentials for their college football playoff maybe takes a little ding from how much Maryland pushed on them. But that speaks to Coach Locksley and his belief in his program and being aggressive to take a swing at the big dogs. You know who else plays not to lose like Coach Fleck right now? James Franklin. And he's gotten the same response from the Penn State fan base. I can tell you that for a fact. The difference is he has the cash behind him. He has the alum support behind him. He has the recruiting behind him to have big 4 or 5-star guys and the talent that goes to the NBA, NFL on a consistent basis, some of the most of all the programs out there because of the history and the tradition and the money that they have behind them. Minnesota doesn't have that. But even with all of that stuff, he still can't find a way to beat Ohio State and Michigan by playing passive and playing not to lose as opposed to playing to win. It just doesn't get it done. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of good from this Ohio State matchup, but fans continue to ask the same questions, so I am going to jump into some of those difficult discussions coming up next. First, I got to talk to you about our friends over at listening.com because college students, listen up. Heck, even those of you in the business spaces, you will definitely find this useful. There is an incredible app called listening.com, which can take any academic paper, PDF, class material, and turn it into an audio book. Listening.com is an app that can read math equations, technical words, complicated documents, and it knows to skip the citations. It knows to skip the footnotes and the references, and it lets you jump straight to the chapter or section you want to listen to. It even has a one-click note-taking button where it automatically puts the last 10 seconds into a notepad for you so you don't have to type notes while you listen. And best of all, usually you only get 2 weeks free with listening.com, but for you, because you are a locked on, loyal, everyday listener, you get to get 3 weeks free if you go to listening.com/locked on. Again, that's listening.com/locked on, and you will get 3 weeks free. So go ahead and give it a try over at listening.com/locked on. All right, Gophers fans, this is going to be the toughest part of today's discussion, and that is answering the questions from a torn fan base, a hurting fan base right now with a disappointing season here with the Minnesota Golden Gophers and the football program. Now, I have 3 questions that I continue to get week in and week out, and I'm going to address it head on. And we're probably going to have to talk about these questions over the offseason, but I want to get it out there now. The first one is this the worst Gophers team of the PJ Fleck era? Now, if you're talking about that question and just the sole word of worst Gophers team in there, my answer would be no. But it might be the worst coaching that he's done in his tenure here, especially offensively. And that's not saying that the additions at defensive line coach and cornerbacks coach haven't been good, because they have. They have made massive strides in that department. And I actually am very encouraged by those hires. The running backs coach, very encouraged by the hire. But when it comes to the larger scale of things, it has been bad. There haven't been adjustments. You can't just blame the offensive coordinators because it seems like they're being outweighed in certain situations, overridden in certain situations. And we have seen the passive conservative approach under 3 different offensive coordinators. Everything feels like this season, especially, it lacks energy, it lacks fire, it lacks discipline. And what used to be strengths on both sides of the ball haven't been that this year, but we haven't seemed to do much to change and adjust or play more to this team's strengths. Now, some of that comes from injuries, of course, but a lot of it is believing in your philosophy over building to your talent. And so Rossi tends to scheme for his talent, and it generally works. But this year's big injuries have taken us out of elements of the things that we like to do and put us more into the stop the bleeding by any means necessary type mentality on the defense. But offensively, we haven't schemed to the players, because otherwise we would have been doing more of everything in our power to get Daniel Jackson the ball and Tristyn Spann-Ford the ball and the pass catchers the ball and get them to create in space. And now some people might bring up, oh, well, Tristyn Spann-Ford has dropped the ball. Yeah, he has had drops. He has had issues with drops. I'm not even going to shy away from that. I'm not going to say he hasn't. But when the team gets him involved early, they get him touches early, get his confidence going early, that's when we've seen the Tristyn Spann-Ford that we know can play. We know can create, the one that can get out there and run for extra yards and run through players and get touchdowns. We've seen that. But when he doesn't get a target to the late third quarter, it almost feels like maybe that target wasn't expected. The look wasn't expected. And then all of a sudden it doesn't happen, or we have a drop, or we have a miscommunication. That's where you start to see some of these errors flash. So not using him in that certain manner, not using Elijah Spencer, who was an almost 1,000-yard receiver last year, who popped off the tape last year. We saw him in the spring game continuously separating in slant routes. I don't even know if I've seen him run more than one or two slant routes, and one of them was this past weekend against Ohio State, and he was open. Athan just missed him. Why aren't we playing to those pass catchers? That seems to be the strength this season. Now that Darius Taylor's out, now that Zach Evans has suffered a second injury, and that's not to say I don't appreciate Jordan Newman, because I do. What he has done for this team has been huge. But that doesn't mean you need to continue to stick to the ground and pound philosophy and keep going no matter who it is and just try to run the clock. No, play to your team's strengths. But it doesn't seem like we're doing that. We're stuck in our style, and I think this year, staying in our style has played to this team's detriment. Now, another question that continuously I keep getting asked week in and week out is Athan Kaliakmanis the future at quarterback? You know what? I've done a lot of defending for Athan on the show, and I don't regret that one bit. But the real answer to that question right now is I don't know. I don't know who is the future at quarterback for this Gophers team. And I've seen some nasty comments about Athan and how he isn't even a D3 level quarterback, and that's blasphemous and hyperbole and all that stuff. And I get it. People are angry. People are upset. People think that armchair quarterbacks, armchair coaches always know what's best. They always know. So I disregard a lot of that stuff. But I have seen more concerned folks with reasonable questions and reasonable outlooks and like, where do we go from here? And I get that. I understand that. The consistency isn't there. The highs are nice, but the lows are bad. The Gophers have themselves in a tough predicament. That is for sure. But the thing I think is absolutely true is that he has the talent and the upside. But right now, things are going too quick. And it seems like the confidence is slowly dwindling a little bit in some of these high pressure situations. Like sometimes instead of just getting rid of the ball, it looks like he's trying to create or trying to keep the play alive, and then he has to eat a sack. And that isn't going to help this team at that point. Sometimes you just got to throw it out. Sometimes you just got to get rid of the ball, not put it in harm's way, but live to see another down. And sometimes I think if the offensive line can't hold up, if things aren't processing the right way, that's where things go bad. And that's in the moments where he looks rattled. So there are also moments where he makes big plays that make you say, how? But we have to find either more of those or more middle ground, more consistency, more balance in the middle. Now, former Gophers quarterback Adam Weber was on the postcast with Ron Johnson and myself after this game, and he also mentioned how the potential is definitely there, and you can see it, but there is still a lot to be cleaned up as well. And I think that's where this Gophers staff is with the young quarterback. I think it's going to come down to this offseason. Minnesota's going to bring in true freshman Drake Lindsey, who's been having a great senior year, but is he going to be able to play up to the speed of a Big Ten right away as a true freshman? That's going to be a tough ask for him as well. You've also got Vioto, Kramer, Shikajansky. All of them are still in this quarterback's room right now. All of them are possibly back unless somebody decides to transfer. Plus, I think Minnesota hits the transfer portal for a vet of some sort, whether it be an FCS guy trying to prove that they can play at the FBS Power 5 level, or whether maybe it's a G5 guy trying to come to the Power 5 to show that he can be a difference maker even at the highest of the highest levels. Now, I don't know if the Gophers will have the NIL to compete for a top quality G5 guy looking for a P5, maybe like a Michael Pratt of Tulane, who, if he comes back instead of testing the draft waters, probably will have a ton of offers, a ton of potential schools that would love to bring him in. But would a G5 heavy hitter want to swing on a middle of the pack SEC or Big Ten school, or would they be pushing to try and compete with one of the 2 or 3 or 4 contenders at the top of those 2 big conferences? The coaches could try to sell it, but I digress. Let's focus on, I think overall, you're going to have some sort of transfer come in. You're going to have Athan. You're going to have the true freshman, and then you're going to have who's been in this room right now. And I think the staff will bring that transfer in, not to just give them the keys, say you're the starter, this is yours, but to make every single quarterback in that room work harder, push more, and go out there and earn the job. Finally, the last question, will a new offensive coordinator help? I'm going to be brief on this one. I don't know. Probably it could be, but it's also on PJ, because if you override your offensive coordinator, then what will change? It's hard to imagine there isn't some overriding when we see the same passive and safe issue rear its head year after year after year with new offensive coordinators. So would I love to see an up-and-coming modern offensive coordinator that has no ties to the current system be in here and take a swing on us and maybe be more pass heavy, but still include a heavy ground approach? I would love that. But would the risk be worth the reward? Athan would be on his 4th offensive coordinator in 4 years, and that could be detrimental for his development. On top of that, if Minnesota is going to try and have a quarterback competition and have them push themselves and go out there and earn the job, then it's not really about that quarterback development, but more so who can go out there and claim the job and shake things up in an expanded conference rather than projecting or protecting development. But also the biggest question there is, would PJ be willing to give up control? No one will want to come in if they can't be given the trust. And I think of Jerry Jones with the Cowboys in this situation, always having to have his hand in the pot, which many say the Cowboys will never win a Super Bowl until Jerry can just be an owner and let the people that he hires do their actual roles. It could be similar. Could it be similar for the Minnesota Gophers in this scenario, but at a coaching level? These are the great questions. I'm sure we're going to talk about them throughout the offseason, but I wanted to touch on them today. Now, tomorrow we're going to turn our eyes to the Wisconsin Badgers, but first I want to talk about the women's basketball team and what we learned from the UConn outing yesterday. That's what's coming up next. First, I got to talk to you about our friends over at FanDuel, because right now new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if you win any $5 moneyline bet. So if you are feeling it tonight with the Chiefs and the Eagles and you know which one is going to take that money line, then I encourage you to put a $5 bet down and you will get $150 back in bonus bucks. And you can bet on spreads, player props, over-unders, and more over at FanDuel. Again, just go to FanDuel.com/LockedOn. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, official partner of Locked On. All right, Gophers fans, I want to wrap it up with a little bit of women's hoops talks, because Gophers took on UConn yesterday and they fought through that first half, and it looked like they were in this thing to win this thing, but it fell apart in the third quarter, and I think it was more so due to being gassed and due to a short bench approach in yesterday's matchup, because that paired with the cold shooting just made it a night that the Gophers couldn't keep up throughout 4 quarters. I was nervous about it in the first half, but I was impressed by how they stood strong. But as they continued to run through the starters and continued to be cold from the shooting, whether it was trying and wanting to win so bad with such a big crowd and prove that fans should be in there supporting them, which they should, because this team is fun and exciting. And although they didn't have their best shooting night yesterday, they absolutely proved that they are a young, talented team that can get wins happening this season. And I have a lot of confidence in this women's basketball team. And it wasn't just me. I asked, or Coach Gino over at UConn was asked about this Gophers team and what he saw from them. I shared that response on Twitter yesterday. It was positive, and he had nothing but good things to say about how this team is going to win games, and they're going to be really, really good. You can tell that they're a young team, but at the same time, there is a lot of great things happening here. And he said his halftime speech was not like, oh, don't worry worry about it. We're going to blow this team out. He wasn't saying that in the one bit because he recognizes that this Gophers team should be respected and that they have a lot of talent. Even though they weren't able to keep up in the long run, he recognized that this Gophers team has a ton of potential. So we saw that potential yesterday, and even though we had an ice-cold start from Mara Braun, who started, I believe, 0 for 10 in the game, and Grace G Money, she started 0 for 6. Those are our two best shooters on this team, and they hardly ever start that cold. But it just happened to happen yesterday. The Gophers outshot UConn in that first half, and they shot only like 20%. It might have been lower than 20% in the first half. If they get some of those buckets to fall, you're talking about having the lead against UConn. You're talking about having the scoring working, and then maybe you do get some more players involved to give them a breather, to keep them fresh, to keep the scoring going. But the Gophers, I think their biggest issue in this one was as the shots weren't falling, they kept fighting, and I love that. That's not the issue. I am very proud of the team and how much they never gave up in that game. But I think they got gassed out as the third quarter came and as the adjustments from Coach Gino came. And then all of a sudden, this Gophers team just couldn't keep up because as they got tired, they moved the ball less and they dribbled more. And the offense became more stagnant and they got more and more shots into the late parts of the clock. And they were still running the clock pretty heavy and getting into the middle late parts of the clock in the first half as well. But they ended up taking shots that weren't as great and a couple bad turnovers in the third quarter. And that's when the big shift happened in the third quarter. But the biggest thing of how much I said, I think this team just got gassed out. You look at the final minutes for this Gophers women's team. Mara Braun, 39 of 40 minutes. Grace Graholski, 39 of 40 minutes. Mallory Heyer, 38 of 40 minutes. Amaya Battle, 38 of 40 minutes. And then Sophie Hart, 34 of 40 minutes. On the bench, you had players, Holloway and Zanano both had 3 minutes. Johnson and Sanders both had 2 minutes. And then Ajak Madal came in for 1 minute at the very end of the game. It's hard to stay in a game with one of the top 10 teams in the entire country that prides itself on pace and physicality on the defense, which you could tell. You could see Mara having a cut over on her eye in the presser after the game. They were taking absolute physicality, elbows, pushing, all the physical basketball play. This was a big physical team, and the Gophers hung in there. Regardless of the score, regardless of the shots not falling, they kept fighting, and that was something to be proud of in its own. But what I took away from this UConn matchup is that the formula is right there. They outshot UConn in that first half, but you just couldn't get the shots to fall. They weren't bad shots. They were open shots that were created through the momentum and the pace of the system and the offense. But you're telling me a team with four players on the entire roster that played minutes last season, but they have this team, this young team that has 3 sophomores, 3 freshmen, 2 transfers, 1 returning upperclassman with a brand new head coach, a brand new coaching staff in a near sellout game, televised game, huge environment, in only their 4th game of the season. And they went toe to toe, especially in the first half with UConn. And they stayed aggressive and physical with UConn. And even though they only really played 5 players heavy minutes, they fought and they clawed and the shots weren't falling. But what we saw from the effort of this Gophers team is that Gophers fans should be proud of this team and also should be buying tickets to these home games to encourage this team to keep the momentum rolling, because this team is fun. This team is exciting. The energy was crazy and they felt that. And as they get more support and they get used to that full crowd atmosphere, I'm going to tell you, those shots are going to fall in the next big one. And there's going to be another big one here when Caitlin Clark and Iowa comes to town later this season. But the Gophers need your support prior to that to get used to that environment, to then knock those down, to then upset a big team like that. So overall, I'm proud. I think this is going to be one of the best tickets on campus, possibly the best ticket on campus as far as Gophers program goes for this season. And what excites me the most is what this staff and what these players are going to learn from this game. Because by the time that this team hits January, it could be on and popping. So it was a tough loss, but there was a lot learned, and you could see even more that this team has no quit and they're headed in the right direction. That's going to do it for us on today's show. I hope you enjoyed it. Row the boat, Sky, you might go Gophers, and as always, don't forget to subscribe.